If you know the history of the American Southwest, you're definitely familiar with the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. It was this incredibly successful, coordinated uprising that completely expelled the Spanish from New Mexico. But what happened next? Well, that is often wrapped in layers of intense historical mythology. So in this explainer, we're going to rely strictly on the historical sources to pull back those layers and uncover the reality of the 1692 Reconquest. For centuries, you see, this event has been famously dubbed the Bloodless Reconquest. It's a phrase you'll find carved into monuments and echoed in textbooks everywhere. But we really need to ask, does that narrative actually hold up? Was it genuinely a peaceful diplomatic triumph, or is there a much darker, much bloodier story hiding right beneath the surface? To make sense of this massive 16-year period of shifting alliances, harsh winters, and brutal revolts, we've structured our explainer into 6 chapters: the myth of 1692, a fractured Pueblo unity, the diplomatic re-entry, the illusion shatters, years of fire and blood, and a complex lasting legacy. Chapter 1, the myth of 1692, a governor's ambition. Let's start with the guy at the absolute center of this narrative, and the myth that essentially grew up around him. Enter Don Diego de Vargas. Now, Vargas was a Spanish nobleman, but he was deeply in debt and seriously stressed about his family's legacy. Appointed governor in 1688, he was a huge risk-taker, handed a nearly impossible job: go reclaim New Mexico from the Pueblo people who had decisively kicked the Spanish out 12 years prior. For Vargas, this reconquest wasn't just a mission. It was his personal ticket to glory, wealth, and royal favor. He needed a win.
And you can see how wild this timeline gets. We go from the unified Pueblo Revolt of 1680 straight through to Vargas's initial, surprisingly peaceful diplomatic re-entry in 1692. But fast forward just 1 year to 1693, and the Spanish colonists return, sparking massive, violent wars that drag on until a second, failed Pueblo uprising in 1696. The sheer contrast between 1692 and the years that followed is honestly the key to understanding this entire story.
Chapter 2, a fractured Pueblo unity, the collapse of an alliance. To figure out how Vargas managed to simply walk back into New Mexico in 1692 without drawing a sword, we have to look at what was actually happening to the Pueblos during their 12 years of independence. By the early 1690s, the Pueblo communities were in a desperate, desperate state. The utopia they had fought for back in 1680, it just never arrived. Instead, they got hit with extreme environmental disasters. We're talking about a devastating 1,000-year drought. I mean, think about that scale. It led to the complete destruction of their harvests and widespread severe famine. And, to make things worse, without the Spanish military around, they faced a massive resurgence of deadly raids from neighboring Apache and Navajo tribes. And internally, things were just as bad. Pope, the hero and architect of the 1680 revolt, kind of lost the plot. He failed to deliver on his promises of prosperity and actually started adopting the exact same oppressive behaviors as the Spanish they just kicked out. He started acting like a dictator, demanding heavy tribute, and get this, he even rode around in the former Spanish governor's carriage. This alienated the different pueblos, completely fractured their pan-Puebloan unity, and turned tribes against one another. The Spanish exploited this disunity perfectly, and they did it with the help of a guy named Bartolomé de Ojeda. He was a mixed-blood Carriz war captain who had originally fought the Spanish super fiercely, but after being badly wounded and captured at the Battle of Zia, he flipped sides. He became this ultimate inside man, using his knowledge of Pueblo infighting to basically mentor Vargas on exactly how to divide and conquer using diplomacy. Chapter 3, the diplomatic re-entry, the 1692 negotiation. So, armed with Ojeda's inside intel, Vargas makes his move. Knowing the Pueblos were divided, starving, and exhausted by raids, Vargas marched north in late summer 1692. But he didn't attack. Instead, he led with diplomacy. He offered pardons, promised religious tolerance, and agreed to dissolve the brutal encomienda tribute system that caused the first revolt anyway. He even peacefully baptized 122 Pueblo children. For a lot of the Pueblos, siding with the Spanish simply looked like a practical way to survive starvation and enemy raids. Vargas was so hyped about this diplomatic victory that he traveled to the famous stone monument at El Morro and literally carved his own legend right into the rock. He boasted that he took back New Mexico without wasting a single ounce of powder or unsheathing a sword. And honestly, that single rock carving cemented the myth of a perfectly bloodless conquest for centuries. Chapter 4. The illusion shatters, the winter of 1693. Because, as you might guess, that illusion of a bloodless peace, it didn't even last a year. The whiplash between these 2 years is just staggering. In 1692, everything was peaceful diplomacy and mutual negotiation. But in 1693, Vargas came back. And this time, he didn't just bring soldiers. He brought hundreds of colonists, families, kids, livestock. And they arrived in the dead of a freezing winter, starving and desperate. The Spanish immediately demanded food and shelter, completely breaking the fragile promises of 1692 and shattering the peace. You see, Vargas was under insane pressure to deliver. His expedition was heavily funded by the Viceroy of New Spain, the Conde de Galvez. Because of this massive royal investment, Vargas returned expecting total, unquestioning submission. But the Pueblo locals in Santa Fe were starving too, so they naturally refused to hand over their desperately low winter food stores to hundreds of new settlers. When they said no, Vargas totally dropped the Diplomat Act and ordered a full-scale, brutal military assault on the city. The battle for Santa Fe was vicious. After laying siege to the capital and dragging the defenders from their hiding spots, Vargas made a calculated, horrific choice. He ordered the immediate execution of 70 Pueblo warriors right outside the city walls. 70 men dead in the dirt, just like that. And with them, any remaining idea that this reconquest was bloodless died too. Chapter 5. Years of Fire and Blood, the Mesa Top Wars. From that day on, the diplomatic mask was off, and New Mexico plunged straight back into existential, all-out war. For the next several years, the landscape was defined by vicious hand-to-hand combat and brutal starvation tactics. And it was incredibly complex because the Pueblo groups were so fractured. Some actually allied with the Spanish out of pure survival or to settle old rivalries, while others fought desperately to keep their independence from the encroaching empire. The fighting settled into this terrifying, grueling pattern. The resisting Pueblos would retreat and fortify themselves up on high, steep mesas. In response, Vargas would launch these exhausting, bloody sieges. In 1694, he literally spent the year dragging heavy cannons up places like Black Mesa just to bombard and starve them out. Finally, in 1696, the Pueblos tried one last coordinated uprising, killing several missionaries and settlers. But without the total unity they had back in 1680, this rebellion was crushed by Vargas and his Pueblo allies. Chapter 6. A complex, lasting legacy, memory, and modernity. So after all the violence, the broken promises, and the fractured alliances, what did this actually leave behind? Surprisingly, the aftermath of 1696 forced both the Spanish colonists and the remaining Pueblos into a really pragmatic coexistence. Neither side could completely wipe the other out. Plus, they suddenly had to tolerate and even rely on each other to survive against rising, terrifying mutual enemies, specifically the nomadic Comanche tribes. They ended up sharing defense strategies, material culture, and an uneasy peace that was born strictly out of absolute necessity. And this isn't just ancient history, it's actively and passionately debated today. Back in 1712, the Santa Fe Fiestas were established to honor Vargas and his supposedly bloodless victory. But by the 1990s, indigenous groups and historians were heavily protesting that one-sided narrative. By 2015, the city officially recognized the violence of the forced resettlement, and in 2020, as society really started grappling with these harsh realities, Vargas's statue was officially removed from downtown Santa Fe. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. As our understanding of history evolves from comfortable, simple myths into complex, often violent realities, how do we best honor all the voices woven into our past? How does a society commemorate a history that's built on both incredible diplomatic survival and undeniable, tragic trauma? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the history you think you know.